Hey there, and welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations here with the Men and Masculine Folks Network. That's a program of Men as Peacemakers where we are shaping new meanings of masculinity that are authentic, caring, and thoughtful. These conversations are here to help us see the inherent dignity of those around us, help us practice collective care and responsibility towards one another, and to do it in a way that acknowledges that we are all human beings who are whole. So, my name is Sean Hayes, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. And I am very excited to be with my friends here and to be with all of you who are tuning in live or if you're watching after the fact. And so, as we mentioned before, our format for these conversations is shifting and adjusting a little bit. And so each month we will be choosing a topic that can help men and masculine folks identify our own roles within communities and with creating safe and thriving communities. So each month we're going to be hosting two conversations about that month's topic, where the first conversation we're going to focus on developing a deeper understanding of this issue at hand. And then during the second conversation in the month, we will talk more about the actual practical, tangible ways that we as men and masculine folks and all people can work alongside each other within communities to create change. So just keep in mind these conversations are a way for us to come together. We're learning new things from different perspectives, as well as it gives us an opportunity to demonstrate how we can have these important conversations with the people in our own lives. So again, we're very glad that you're joining us, whether you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube, or if you're tuning in later. Thank you again for being here and connecting with us.
So, as you know, January is Trafficking Awareness Month, and we will be having a conversation about trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. And we're so happy to welcome our special guest star, Noelle Volin. Noelle is the director of Men, We're All Connected and Men As Peacemaker, or MAP. Uh, I'm sorry. These encompass MAP statewide and national community level prevention programs, including the Don't Buy It Project, the Best Campus Sexual Violence Prevention Program, and the We're All Connected Project. Previously, Noelle served as the staff attorney and trafficking policy coordinator at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MENCASA, as a project lead for the Minnesota statewide Safe Harbor Protocol Implementing Project, funded by the Minnesota Department of Health. Noelle assisted multidisciplinary teams across the state, developing a community-specific system response to sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Prior to her time at MENCASA, Noelle was a staff attorney and director of policy and education at Breaking Free, a Minnesota-based nonprofit serving sexually exploited women and girls. She created the criminal justice advocacy programs for victims facing criminal charges as a result of exploitation, and implemented a pro bono legal clinic to meet the myriad civil legal needs of victims. In addition, Noelle facilitated the Offenders Prostitution Program, or John School, for men charged with solicitation, and represent the voices of survivors and advocates on state and federal policy initiatives. So we're super excited to have Noelle with us. But before we get into our conversation today, let's take a minute. And I know probably Sean introduced himself a little bit, but we'll do it again. Let's take a minute for each to introduce ourselves. I'll start myself. My name is Felix Martinez. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I work for Esperanza United as the Engaging Men and Boys Program Specialist. So, Sean, you want to jump in, and then we'll let Noelle introduce herself.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. So again, I'm Sean Hayes, and my pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am here in Duluth at Men As Peacemakers, where I coordinate our Don't Buy It project, as well as help co-coordinate our Men and Masculine Folks Network.
Hi, my name is Noelle Volin, and I get to work with Sean at Men As Peacemakers. I am not based in Duluth. I am working remotely from rural Minnesota, Mora, Minnesota. I'm really happy and excited to be here. I know that we've been running these conversations for a while. This is my first time getting to participate, so thank you for having me. And you're right, this is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. You might see folks on social media wearing blue. I'm wearing navy, which maybe doesn't count, but blue is the color if folks want to recognize that. So again, thank you for having me.
So Noelle, can you please give us a brief story about how you got involved in this kind of work you do? As part of this introduction, please.
Well, sure. And Felix, thank you for the really great and thorough introduction in the beginning. But probably the TLDR version of it is I got into this work. Maybe I'll back up. So before I came to Minnesota, I went to law school, did that thing. I spent some time overseas. And part of that time was spent in Japan for about 5.5 years. And I noticed some things in Japan. I noticed some stuff happening. And that got me interested in looking at trafficking. So when I got out of law school, and you have to do the thing where you take the bar and wait to see if you actually passed it, I started volunteering at Breaking Free. And I think for anybody doing this work, if it's at all possible to jump in and do work directly with survivors, and especially if you can work under survivors as your colleagues, that's amazing, because doing advocacy gives you this perspective of what this looks like on the ground, how systems are responding, what the impact is on people's lives, and you just get a really human perspective on this really complex problem of trafficking. And so I started out like jumping in. I had no business jumping in, doing work with the legal system and with policy, but I was lucky to be brought up and surrounded by very experienced survivors and folks who knew the system inside and out and offered some really good perspectives for what they needed, because they were experiencing the violence themselves. And so they could see where there were gaps in the criminal justice response, in the service response, in awareness. And I am so forever grateful that they lent me their wisdom and insights while I was there. But there's something to be said about direct service work. You're working with real people whose real lives are impacted. And it's not always going to be a happy ending to some stories. And that was really frustrating, because you're working with folks and you only want the best and you want them to thrive. And I think, as you're having these conversations, and particularly, engaging men in conversations around how do we have safe and thriving communities, when you get down to this human level and you make a connection with real people and real lives that are being impacted, it is hard not to want to change everything. And so I was seeing things happening over and over again. And some of that can be changed through policy. And some of it is a matter of practice catching up to policy changes. But I wanted to try and get in at the systems level, so you are not banging your head against the same wall over and over again. And so I went from this direct victim services, working at an individual level, to then working with multidisciplinary teams and working with folks that I thought had a little bit more control over the response and how things were going and how do we improve it, and how do we tear down the walls that were like survivors and victims were facing. And then it, working in systems can be frustrating too. And so the opportunity came up to do prevention, which I think a lot of people are like, yeah, sure, prevention. How are you going to prevent this harm? And you really have to have this understanding that things don't have to be the way they are. They don't have to continue this way. And prevention for me was both strategic and hopeful. And so getting to work, I came in to Men As Peacemakers, working where Sean is now with the Don't Buy It project, which was like, how do we get men, everyday men and masculine folks and others in the community to start taking steps towards prevention, to reducing the occurrence of exploitation happening. And so it's fun now to be on this side, to be thinking, it's like forward thinking, it's very strategic thinking, like how we know this stuff happens, we know it impacts real people in real lives, and how do we prevent, how do we stop it from happening in the first place? So that's how I got into this like prevention side of things. And I am very blessed to be able to have worked with Sean and work with Felix in different capacities, doing this work together, which is what it takes. It takes all of us working together. So maybe that wasn't TLDR. Maybe that was just like too long.
I think that was perfect. And yeah, there's definitely no right or wrong answers to any of these questions. And I think it's a good reminder for all of us at home, when we're trying to have these conversations with friends or families, there's no one right way to have these conversations. So I just appreciate hearing, a little bit of that history as well, and getting a chance to work with you, Noelle, has been a really wonderful thing for me. And I'm sure I speak for Felix as well. But yeah, thank you so much again for being here with us, and for that great story about how you have come to be in this place you are now. And as a reminder, with Trafficking Awareness Month, this first conversation, we really want to do a lot of learning, and we know that you have a lot of expertise and experience, and really just a wealth of knowledge. And so our first question, our official question is, what are some basic things that you would like everyone to know about trafficking? And I'll also throw in, this term commercial sexual exploitation, and maybe you can expand on what that means as well. But what are those basic things that everyone should know about trafficking?
That's a really good question, a really big question. And I think in Minnesota in particular, a lot of groundwork has been laid about some of the foundations of trafficking and the basics of trafficking. I should probably start out and say this because this came up during a training presentation yesterday. Somebody was asking about trafficking, and they were using the federal definition, which includes the components of force, fraud, or coercion. So maybe like one of the basic things that we should just make sure that everybody knows is that in the state of Minnesota, trafficking, the law does not have an element requiring force, fraud, or coercion. So our definition is receiving, recruiting, enticing, harboring, providing, or obtaining by any means a person for the purposes of prostitution, or receiving anything of value, knowing that it came from prostitution. So basically, are you doing an act that is facilitating prostitution of somebody else, right? Or are you benefiting from the exploitation and prostitution of somebody else? And I think that's important because when you remove that element of force, fraud, or coercion needing to be required, the emphasis then is really on the actions of this third party who is taking steps to make sure that prostitution or exploitation occurs. And so there's this knowing action, and the focus is on the action. Are you benefiting from it? Are you facilitating it in any way? And that action is what our law says, don't do that. That causes harm. So I think that's important to make clear, that when we're talking about our state recognizes the act in itself causes harm, and that is what the crime is. Probably the other thing that's important to recognize is that, I think this has happened in a lot of other states. Finally, folks have caught up, but there was a time where we adjudicated youth for engaging in prostitution. And basically that means that the juvenile justice system, like their version of the criminal justice system, was handling cases where youth were engaging in prostitution. In other words, they're kind of treated like criminals, right? You're committing a crime. We don't convict juveniles, we adjudicate juveniles. And so that's what we were doing in response to this activity. But then at the same time, we had a law that was like, if you solicit a minor, that's a felony. So if you're a victim of that felony, you're also going to be adjudicated. And I think if I look at this in the most generous light, that was our state's way of saying we need some sort of jurisdiction over these youth, some way of making sure we have a connection to them to make sure that they're getting out of this harmful activity and into services. But it doesn't, that's not a great way to handle it. And so we passed Safe Harbor Law in 2011. It went into effect in 2014. That law basically shifted our whole approach, our whole way of thinking, the way our laws handled things, the way our systems engaged with this, shifted it from a juvenile justice approach to a child protection approach. And again, I think this points to Minnesota's emphasis on an awareness of the harm that this is causing, right? So juveniles might be engaging in prostitution. It is harmful for them. That's harmful. And there's a lot of data and statistics about why. There's, I think maybe that's the third thing folks should know. Prostitution, whoever's involved, however you get involved, whether you say you're a victim, whether you say this is a choice, statistically, most people in prostitution experience psychological harm and trauma. And that psychological harm and trauma doesn't just occur when the crime is occurring. It's lifelong. That's a lifelong impact. And so that has lifelong costs to the individual, to their families, to society. And so when we're looking at prostitution, we can't just look at like a single act. We need to understand the broad ripple effect of the harm that is occurring. Even if you say you're engaging in it by choice, still statistically, those folks still experience psychological harm. And that's not to mention some of the other, like I know folks that I've worked with have experienced physical harm. So I would say those are some pretty foundational things that folks would need to know and know as they're engaging in conversations, because this is a hot topic, especially if you say prostitution. That's a hot button issue. And folks have very strong feelings on that. And it's good. I think we should be talking about it, but I hope folks are talking about it in the right way. Yeah. And Sean, you asked a good question. Why are we saying commercial sexual exploitation and in trafficking in the same sort of, we use it interchangeably, and they're kind of the same, but they're similar, but they're not the same. So just to clarify, like commercialized sex is anything that involves an exchange of sex for anything of value. So it could be money, it could be something else. So that like commercialization of sex. You could look at pornography, you could look at stripping. These are legal things in many contexts. And then there's prostitution is also included in that. And why we group this together, or we talk about them, I don't think we group them together, but we talk about them together often is, there's studies that show too that like recruitment happens. Pornography can be used also as a tool for educating victims to teach them this is what you're supposed to be doing when you're going out and getting a customer. So there's too much of a connection. Also, frankly, I've worked with folks who experience a lot of harm, physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual harm when they're in these industries that are legal. And so I think the distinction is that trafficking is specifically for prostitution using a third-party trafficker by any means. But then when we talk about commercialized sexual exploitation, we're looking at the harm that results within industries where there's an exchange of something of value for something that's sexual.
I appreciate you clarifying that, because I think, like you said, I think this can be a very hot button topic with a lot of folks, especially when you think about folks who are doing this movement type work within prevention or direct services versus sort of your average person who may not have, this deeper understanding of all of the nuances and the ways that harm happen within, these industries, as you said. So I appreciate you kind of expanding on that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, imagine having a conversation with peers or friends or coworkers. And maybe I'll throw this back at you all. Do you find that it's easier to talk about trafficking and get everybody on board with, yeah, trafficking is bad, But then things get a little more complex and nuanced when we're talking about prostitution. Even if it's illegal, there's a lot of different views on prostitution. And then, well, certainly like pornography or strip clubs, other areas of the sex industry. Have you found that that's the case where like people are really able to talk about trafficking is bad, and then I don't know, how do you handle the conversations on these other topics of commercialized sex?
Thank you, Noelle and Sean. For me, it's very eye-opening, especially for when we're having this conversation with the youth, just because anything related to sex, prostitution, most of the youth, especially young boys, it catch their attention. They get really excited. They want to hear more. But when you start learning a little bit of all those intersections, the conditions that create to human trafficking and commercial exploitation to exist, and especially for communities of colors or Latinos, specifically when the community that I work with, it just opened their minds and it changed their perspective because of TV and movies like Traffic. They create this false narrative of people that are exploited. And when we realize that, specifically for Latinos, people like me, we tend to be more vulnerable just because sometimes we don't have documents, or maybe because we're more vulnerable because of the color of our skin. It's harder for us to find jobs. And when you have this conversation with the youth, it just totally changed their perspective. It starts from a conversation when they're all really excited, sharing what they know, to a lot of silence when they're starting to realize all the harm caused with pornography, with prostitution, things like OnlyFans, things that we have normalized, and we don't realize that behind that there are people that are being exploited, people that been hurt, people that could be your sisters, could be my dad, could be my grandfather, because it's not only happened to women and girls, also happened to men and boys, also to the LGBTQ, non-binary folks. This is so big. There's so many intersections. So normally you end those sessions like very quiet, a lot of thinking, and it comes to the point that we need to learn also what we can do. Once we know all these conditions that create this, what we can do. So obviously having these conversations is the first step. They're difficult conversations because for most of the regular folks, they're limited of the information that they have, but we're lucky enough to have this amazing thing called the internet, where we can research and find more information and find amazing organizations like MEP, like Men As Peacemakers, that are having these amazing tools for us, the regular Joe, for the community to connect to each other, to learn and understand the impact that we all have, that role that we all have if we want to end sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, because we have that potential. And something that we learned from MAP is that we all can share our gifts. We don't need to do this alone. And this is something that has inspired me to continue doing this, not only during my time that I'm working with the organization Esperanza United, but also when I'm with my friends, having this type of conversation and creating awareness. So this is very complex. Their conversations, they're not easy, but I think they're out there. Once we talk and we understand it, once we go outside and we see what's in TV, what's in the in the internet, we realize that this is something that's really already in our communities, and we need to do something.
Felix, I like how you you said it. You just sort of brought it up. How you don't always have conversations. We're all in roles where these conversations come up frequently, and maybe people not just professionally, but also like people in our personal lives will come up and ask questions. And because it's not all of this stuff is common knowledge, it's not into the narratives. And you mentioned narratives too, and how we talk about this issue. And I think that's precisely the point here, is I think the general public has access to certain pieces of information and certain sources of information, and those sources are all going to have a different narrative. And so using our gifts, as you said, how and our relationships with folks and our role in community, how do we start shifting the conversation, giving people the information that they need to know? Because you're right, too. There are some things that have been normalized, right? We have a normalization of a lot of activities that that normalization is like just embedded in culture. So we don't even know that we're not even aware of the fact that that's part of how we think and act and exist, right? Like there's this pastor that I listen to, and he's like, culture is like, it's the air we breathe. It's like trying to explain to somebody or trying to explain to a fish what water is. How are you going to explain to a fish what water is, right? They're just swimming in it all the time. And so there are things that young people are swimming in and things that we are swimming in that are just part of the way we think and act and engage with the world and understand the world. And we're not even aware of it. It's like air to us, land dwelling creatures, right? And that normalization of certain things can cause us to miss important pieces of information, or to have conversations in a way that's like not actually capturing the full problem. Sarah, our executive director at Men As Peacemakers, always talks about like looking at things from a 360-degree view. You're looking at it from all angles. And if you don't have access to the information, you can't understand or talk about the issue in that way, in that 360-degree way, because what the air that we breathe is what is being normalized, that's being shaped by different sources of information that may not include like statistics about folks experiencing psychological harm and conditions that make it so that trafficking can happen in the first place, or that trafficking happens to somebody in an urban setting different from a rural setting, different from folks who have different immigration status or don't speak English as a first language, or all sorts of LGBTQ community. There's so many ways that trafficking occurs and that exploitation can occur. And you're right, it's not like a normal part of most people's daily conversation. So that's a really good point that you brought up.
Yeah. Oh, and I'll add, oh, sorry, cutting you off there, Felix. I was just gonna say, when I think about conversations I've had with friends, primarily within the transgender community and then the larger LGBTQ plus community or queer community, these conversations have been very awkward and uncomfortable, especially when I'm trying to sort of explain what, trafficking actually looks like based on what I've learned doing this work. And oftentimes for those conversations, what comes up from that other person is like, the term sex work and how do we, do this work while also trying to take into account sex workers' experiences and their stories and what they have to bring and into this entire conversation. And, historically, at least within queer and trans communities, again, like you said, Felix, like there's a huge struggle for folks to find employment to survive. Just, your basic McDonald's job or anything. Like when folks can't get a job, again, I think about folks here who have talked about, making a bad choice or having this other bad choice. If you're faced with two bad options, do I put food on the table for my kids, or do I, engage in prostitution or sex work or some type of thing in order to do that? Like that's really not a choice at all when our community is just not actually willing to accept all of the people in it. So when folks have to do these things to survive, and I know so many people within my community here locally and then nationally and internationally, like these huge, very well-known trans activists and advocates have, and they talk very directly about their own experiences with having to do sex work and I know I've heard the term like survival sex as well, right? Like we have to do this to eat to, have a place that's safe to sleep. And so making the distinction between someone who feels like they are making this choice for themselves versus the people who are sort of, being taken or, being exploited in that way, where they have literally been taken away and are isolated and away from family and community. That's the challenging part that I've found, is like, yes, there can be this group of folks who say, this is not about us. We don't need your help. We don't need this programming. While on the other side, there are tons and tons and tons of people who are harmed, have been harmed, and will continue to be harmed unless we, again, like you said, Noelle, try to take this 360-degree perspective when it comes to this issue.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because when I hear you guys talking, one of the things that come to my mind is privilege, because when I was growing up, I never hear about this stuff. And for other folks, this is their everyday life. They see it every single day, and sometimes if you hearing this for first time, or you heard but you didn't listen to the conversation, maybe this is a time to realize that this is a problem, a community problem that don't only affect Latinos or communities of color or the LGBT community. It happened to all of us. And I have a question for you, Noelle, probably curiosity. What is something that maybe you have learned, obviously you know a lot at this point, that in doing this work, that surprised you, or made you change your mind or your approach, or make you change careers, and you know what, this is something that I never knew, and now this is a aha moment in my life. Is there something that surprised you, that surprised Noelle Volin by any chance?
That's a good question, Felix. So, man, I have been doing this work for over a decade. I know this because I put in my public service loan forgiveness and finally put in the 10 years to get that paid off. So it's been over a decade. And okay, I'm just going to be fully transparent and honest about the field of anti-trafficking and how things started out. Because Sean, I think you brought up some really good points. When we first started out this anti-trafficking movement, I think the first challenge that this field really had to overcome was getting people to care and believe that it was happening in their communities, right? And so our approach was not the best. So this is how we did it. We would put survivors on display. We would make them relive their trauma and tell their stories over and over again, often, most often, with no compensation and no supports afterwards. I mean, that's like reliving the trauma. And then we would sort of like guilt people into caring, and we would scare them into caring, and we would scare them into believing that this happens. And that it was that shock value, right? A little bit of voyeurism, a lot of bit of voyeurism, and it was almost exploitive how we did it ourselves, right? And I think I understand the intention behind it. We have to tell these stories, right? Like I was in roles where I was sharing examples of scenarios of things that I was seeing as a service provider. I was watching my colleagues go up again and again and again. And the expectation was, you are going to bare your soul, relive your trauma, so that the audience, whether it's a community audience, whether it's a community, like professionals being trained and being told, like, you have to shift your mindset, you have to have more sympathy, you can't just proceed as if these, folks that you're encountering are criminals, and so care about it, please care about it, and this is why. And you give these stories that were incredibly emotional. They were true. They were people's lived experiences. It is important that people who want to share their lived experiences can do so. But the way our field handled it, if I reflect on it honestly, was exploitive. You could use that term, exploitive. And again, I get why we did it. And so those were the narratives that we were like throwing out there, right? To get people to care. And that did a couple of things. First, it made people understand trafficking according to an individual lived experience. So it didn't capture the full spectrum. So if you didn't give somebody a platform, a survivor, to tell their story, maybe you're left with the impression that trafficking does happen with kidnapping or being pulled away from the family, and you're not hearing about familial trafficking. Or maybe you are hearing stories about how folks were being exploited online by traffickers of a particular race and ethnicity, and you weren't understanding like how these like wealthier white individuals were also engaging in trafficking, or how youth were saying, here, my girlfriend will do this for you if you give us drugs, right? So you have juveniles engaging in exploitation of one another and the buying, right? Like that exchange was happening. How are we as a system going to handle when the youth are also perpetrating, right? Like we weren't prepared for that, because the stories we were hearing over and over again, not only were we exploiting the individuals who were telling their stories, but we're also narrowing the general public's understanding of those stories. But this is also, because Sean, you brought this up with your community and conversations you've had about survival sex and OnlyFans and not being able to have mainstream jobs. I think the other damaging results of our initial approach was that we were trying to say that trafficking happens and it's exploitive, and we were excluding other voices. Now, there were definitely folks in the field, I think Dr. Lauren Martin is one of them, who made an effort to talk to different people who might have been in the sex industry and had different perspectives. And they would not identify as a victim. And at least not in the traditional sense, where we're like, as a state, we're going to have this response and we're going to provide all these services. They would not put themselves in that category. And there's always been this tension between anti-trafficking movement, the abolitionist movement, right? And then sex worker rights. There's always been this tension and disagreement. And to some extent, the ideology is a little bit different, and there isn't going to be agreement. But there doesn't have to be, because something that you also said, Sean, that I think needs to be a part of the conversation that isn't. Regardless of whether you identify as a victim or if you identify as a sex worker, what you pointed out, Sean, is the community conditions. And I don't think we talk about that enough, because people just they're not used to talking at that level. We are relational creatures. We engage at this like individual relationship level a lot. And so taking the like bird's eye view approach and looking down and seeing, how is our community structured? How are our systems and institutions structured? How are our values and traditions and practices and culture? How do they play out in a way that like creates on-ramps or entry ramps into exploitation? Where you pointed out like this tough choice of like, okay, do I try and get a mainstream job that's not going to pay me enough, or that won't hire me because I'm trans? Or do I engage, like, do I set up an OnlyFans account? Because that's the way that I'm going to be able to live my life and survive in this world, right? Like we're not talking about the fact that choice is presented to human beings as this is your choice, right? What is it in the way our communities are set up where somebody is faced with that choice? Because I wasn't, and Felix, you brought up privilege. That was not a choice that was presented to me. I had a very, clear path with many options that did not include survival sex or setting up OnlyFans or sex work, any of that, right? Like that just wasn't a part of what I thought my options were. And I had a clear path forward to have a career, to have education, to live and exist and have a role in society and feel valued in that community and in that role. And acknowledging that is a privilege that not everybody experiences, right? Because we have conditions in the community, both in culture, in our policies and practices, in the way the world is currently set up, where some folks don't have the same path that I do. And in fact, their pathway is kind of urging them into a direction. But again, maybe they don't identify as a victim in this. Maybe this is empowering for them, and that's their perspective. And as if you're in the abolitionist movement, You don't get to tell somebody, no, 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 no. You actually are a victim. You must talk about yourself as a victim or a survivor. You can't do that. But what you can do is point out, and I think there will be more agreement on those community level conditions. And that to your question, Felix, about like how I would change my approach, like what I've learned. I just whatever. I'm old and I have gray hair. That's why I'm wearing a hat. So sometimes it's life and just getting to know more people and getting to a place where you're listening to them more and understanding their experiences and just doing a lot of learning instead of imposing like your own views. Just soaking it all in and listening, and then taking that learning and using that to understand the world in a different way. So that comes with age. Whoever's listening that's like younger than 30, I'm just gonna say your gray hairs it's a reflection of wisdom. I'm just joking. Okay, so basically, yes, that just talking with more people and getting a different perspective and realizing that our tension, right, between sex worker rights groups and like the Red Umbrella folks, and then the abolitionist movements, we're actually fighting about the wrong things. We're actually disagreeing on the wrong things. Because I think if you dig deeper, we could agree more on community level conditions. Like, how do we set things up so that, because we're not even at the point of like, are you a victim, are you a survivor, or are you a sex worker? That's not even, that conversation can't happen yet until we start addressing community level conditions. And so if I would go back and change how we did stuff as a movement, I would maybe not do the shock and awe and the exploitive, like, bare your soul, tell your story, make people like care, make people want to do something about this because they get to have a window into your trauma. I wouldn't do it like that, because that's not everybody's experience, and also that's not effective in getting people to not just look at individual situations like, well, this person experienced this trauma and exploitation because of their individual circumstances. No, it's distracting people from looking at the community level conditions, like these things that are in place that either create entry ramps or, quite frankly, block the exit ramps out of exploitation. Like if somebody somebody from the trans community, Sean, was working in OnlyFans and they didn't like it and they wanted to get out, but they're like, what else am I supposed to do? Right? That's an exit ramp that's blocked. Our society is set up so their exit ramp is blocked. And that's the conversation we need to be having. And I think that's where there doesn't need to be, there can be more collaboration between two different viewpoints and two different ideologies.
Ooh, that was a good answer and got me thinking a lot there. And you know, I know this was a question for you, but I also think the thing that came to mind for me when I think about what are some things that surprised me when I was originally starting to learn about trafficking, and it's actually I've shared this story here and there, but that's actually how I got involved in this work to begin with. Was I happened to see a flyer for a free class called the Don't Buy It Project at Men As Peacemakers. I had never really heard about MAP, and I was like, oh, a free class. Like, I don't know anything about this. I want to join this. And it was this year-long, program. And holy crap! I mean, the ideas that I had learned, and I think, primarily through media, through movies and TV and music and these different things that we sort of just passively intake or take in, gave me a really different image of what this looks like. Like I mentioned the word taken, right? And I think a lot of us will remember those movies with Liam Neeson, Taken, and it was all about like trafficking. This young white girl was being trafficked overseas, and this father is trying to save her, right? And for me, the idea that, wow, that story, that sort of framework of like, there's these bad guys who come and kidnap and take, and or even thinking about like sexual violence in general or sexual assault, how that happens. We sort of are like fed this story of like there's this bad guy, you know, hiding in the bushes, or someone is waiting, like this stranger person, to like take our people or take our children. And for me, it was so surprising to learn that a lot of the times it's someone you know. It's someone who's in your family, it's your neighbor, it's your pastor, it's, you know, I mean, it's like people who are connected to us, who have that access to us. Oftentimes it's not, you know, I was out at the mall and some stranger came and like kidnapped me, right? It is like this very, I mean, it's disturbing when you really think about it, right? It's like these people who are supposed to be safe around us, and we make that assumption that everyone around us is safe, and yet those are the people who have access, and who exploit the vulnerabilities that they know about us. And so I think that was really surprising to me, and I think a lot of people still have this idea of like, you know, when you Google trafficking or you know, exploitation, like there's still the pictures of like white women with like handcuffs and like just this very visual story of how this happens. And it's just really not the case, you know, oftentimes. And so, you know, just taking that little bit of time to learn about, you know, how does this actually show up in our communities, taking that time to think through it and listening to the survivor stories, and being able to notice those, the similarities between stories. And then, like you're saying, then we can really start to address what are the root causes, like what is happening in our communities that's allowing these folks to be harmed, to be exploited and trafficked. And so again, very eye-opening for me. And not a lot of people do this work, you know, like us, and have the ability to learn that. They just see the movie Taken and they think, oh, well, I don't have to worry about that. And so how can we really, you know, do that awareness building in our work, while also, you know, I think like you said, Noelle, like thinking about the bigger systems level of how do we make this bigger change in our society so that this harm is happening way, way less. And so just on that note, I want to move us into our next question here. I know we're running out of time. This is such an interesting conversation, and so I'm very grateful for it. But, you know, within Men as Peacemakers and within the Men and Masculine Folks Network, oftentimes what we're talking about is how important it is to increase community connectedness in order for us to build our communities safer and to make them more resilient, and to actually be able to think about what thriving communities might actually look like. And so our next question for you, Noelle, is how have you seen community connectedness showing up in your work? Or on the flip side, how does a lack of that connectedness impact your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, the observation that you made about how trafficking is occurring within our communities, it's often folks who are like play an important role in our lives, in our community spaces. You know, working with men who were sentenced to the drown school, right? They had to go to this class, with the idea that like maybe we could give them information that will help them change their attitudes and behaviors, right? But these were pastors and coaches and teachers and some public health officials too, right? And some prosecutors. Also, it was just that, you know, to me, it really speaks to this point about interconnection and community connectedness, because violence like this doesn't occur in isolation. It doesn't just happen on the fringes of society. Like these are people in our lives who are experiencing harm, and people in our lives who are causing harm or even contributing to conditions that lead to harm. And we can't treat it as if we are disconnected from this issue. We're not, because we are all connected by this community and these links. And so therefore all of us have this role to play, right? And so one of the things that I think you're asking about, community connectedness or disconnect. So I do want to make clear that even though I don't think we should exploit survivors for their stories, I do think we need, like, as you said, we need to listen to them and learn from them. And so there are a lot of different resources out there that have captured survivor stories. There are a lot of ways to hire survivors as subject matter experts. There's been work done through the Department of Health where you can work with subject matter experts with lived experience, and they can help you shape the programming, right? Like, why start an educational program for folks if that's not what's going to meet their need, right? Listen to survivors, have them come in, shape an educational or job program, have them advise on protocols for, how prosecution, how law enforcement is going to respond. There are ways to do that. Because when we are disconnected from those who are most impacted by the harm, that disconnect will show up at a minimum, ineffective programming, but actually it could continue or cause harm or additional harm. And so you can sort of see how that would happen, right? I think one area of disconnect, and this is going to be a touchy subject, but I'm going to say it because I have learned from it. We have a document out there called Voices of Safe Harbor, and I don't know, Felix or Sean, if you're able to like Google and put that in the comments so folks can read it. Otherwise, we can send it out in an email or post it to our social media. But Voices of Safe Harbor is valuable because it captures survivor voices, youth and adults. So when it comes to disconnect, right, here's one area in particular. There was a quote in there that says, either it says something like youth of color or people of color are not safe around the police. Okay, so folks are going to get tensed up when they hear that. Whoa, cops are doing their job. They're trying to protect. Well, here's the problem. If you have a community that does not feel safe around law enforcement, they will not go to law enforcement for help, right? They will not ask them to, they won't call. Like, you've just shut down an access point to resources, to protection, right? So much damage has been done. That now you have removed a resource from a particular group of people. So that disconnect could cause a lot of harm, right? Doing prevention work would entail law enforcement rebuilding trust, repairing trust, acknowledging damage where damage is done, striving to build a relationship so that now you don't have youth of color saying, I can't go to police for help when I need help, when I think I'm being groomed or recruited, when there's somebody standing outside the homeless shelter trying to talk with, or on social media or whatever, trying to get me to engage in prostitution. How do we repair trust in that community? How do we restore that access point to services, right? So that maybe in the future, the repair has been done where somebody does feel comfortable saying, calling law enforcement saying, I need help and I need to get out of here. And law enforcement's response is compassionate and empathetic and trauma informed and victim centered. And they go out there and they're able to take somebody away from a situation that could be exploitation, right? Or could have led to exploitation, to prevent that harm from happening in the first place. So I think that's an area where, I mean, it's very clear, and we can listen and learn from survivors and those who are directly impacted by sex trafficking and other forms of sexual exploitation. We can learn from them and see where the disconnect is. On the other hand, the connection piece, man, if you are connecting in with survivors and the communities of which they are a part, not, the communities that they identify with, you can structure your response to be more tailored. And Felix, you and I have worked on this, and Sean has worked on this. We worked with the Don't Buy It project, and we got feedback from folks. This is great for white people. It's not going to work in our community. So we were able to work with MUSAC and reframe this document and these materials and resources for men in tribal communities. Right. It is a different language. It's a different framing. It's a different approach, but it's still saying, men, we need you to help create a soft landing space when exploitation has occurred. We need you to help us create safe, thriving communities. And then we got to work with Esperanza United on creating a similar resource that was relevant for Latino men. Right. And that resulted in like us shifting how we did our resources with the mainstream curriculum. So there's like shared learning. that connection is also creating resources that are like more helpful. And so I love seeing that kind of connection happen, because we know the risks. We know what is at what it will cost if we're disconnected and we try and do this work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that knowledge. But because of time right now, I have another question. Are there any resources out there that would you recommend for people that want to learn more about human trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, or about sex trafficking? Anything you can share?
I'm so glad you asked, Felix. I'm pretty sure, Sean, if you put it in the comments. We have a website that has our mainstream curriculum. Just so folks know, like the original curriculum was for group setting only. It was 20 sessions. And we learned from our community partners, right? That connection to community, that's not going to work. Some folks do, like Felix does a lot of work in schools and has access to be able to do this like formalized group setting, but he needed it adapted for youth and for Latino youth. And so the mainstream resource right now is structured so that you can go to the website. You can either attend a training, sign up for our email list if you want to know when the next in-person facilitator training is, or you can watch these videos and some other training videos to get familiar with the content. And then you can download, like, okay, I have a men's group, or I have a Bible study group, or I do a group at a kids organization, youth organization, after school organization. I want to do some of these activities. You can download the individual activities, but then, Sean, as you said, sometimes these conversations aren't happening in a formal group setting. Not everybody does the work that we do. Sometimes it's just a conversation. And so we structured the curriculum to be like, here, you can still cover these issues in a conversation with somebody in a more natural way. And so please feel free, visit our website, menaspeacemakers.org. What is it, / is that how we say it? Don't Buy It Project. And or click on that link. And then also on our website, you can find more information about Felix's work with the Don't Buy It Project We Are Community curriculum for the Latinx community. So that's always available. And then always feel free and get in contact with Sean or Felix about this stuff.
Woo! Yes, always. We always want y'all to get in contact with us. We love to connect with more and more of you and to, start utilizing some of these really excellent tools that we've created and worked with many, many people from many different communities on to bring together. So thanks for sharing those resources, and you can check down in the comments below. I've dropped links for the Voices of Safe Harbor that you mentioned previously, as well as where you can find more information about the Don't Buy It project. And so as we are wrapping up our conversation here, I want to ask Noelle a final question, and that is, what do you feel hopeful about for the future, and for our future generations?
That is a great question. You know what? I think I'm hopeful. I mean, I have a 10-year-old, right? And she asks amazing questions. It keeps me on my toes. And that's something I'm noticing about younger generations now. They are not afraid to ask hard questions. And so as adults, it's up to us to like make sure that we encourage that question asking, but also we better have a response. So if we need to do research on the back end so that we can respond to them, we should. But I like this questioning, right? It's this truth seeking. It's this questioning of the status quo. It is questioning with an eye towards we could do things differently. And so that makes me hopeful and excited about the future.
Well, thank you again so much, Noelle, for taking the time to be with us here at the kitchen table today and for sharing all of your wealth of knowledge with us about this issue of trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation.
Thank you from my side too, Noelle. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. But as a reminder, we're holding these conversations every Thursday at 12 p.m. Central Time. Join us for our next live conversation. Going to be Thursday, January 25th at 12 p.m. Central Time, where we'll be talking to Stephanie Lazaro, Stephanie Lazaro is Safe Harbor coordinator for Esperanza United. So we're very excited to talk to her, to learn from her, and to continue this conversation in a different level.
Definitely looking forward to that conversation. So don't forget, you can follow us on social media to stay connected with the Men and Masculine Folks Network. You can like and follow us on Facebook. You can subscribe to us on YouTube. And if you happen to be watching this conversation as part of your virtual training for the Don't Buy It project, you can check the description below for more instructions about how you can download corresponding discussion and activity guides that Noelle mentioned. And as always, we encourage y'all to have conversations like this with the people in your lives. If you heard something that you learned today, something that has surprised you from our conversation, we really encourage you to start sharing those things with the people in your life, families, loved ones, relatives, coworkers. Because together we are building interconnected communities that are free from violence, where everyone, all of us, can thrive together. So thank you very much again for all of you who have joined us. Thank you again, Noelle and Felix, for this really amazing conversation. And we will see y'all in a couple of weeks where we'll be joined with Stephanie. Thank you again for joining us here at the kitchen table.